Welcome to Roll for Insight, the D&D podcast where we dive into the game, the lore, and the internet's favorite arguments. Grab your dice and your character sheet, and let's roll for insight. Hello, welcome to Roll for Insight. In this episode, we're going to be talking about the Invisibility spell of the 2024 D&D Player's Handbook. So, Invisibility is a level 2 illusion spell for the Bard, Sorcerer, Warlock, and Wizard classes. And this is one of the most versatile spells in the game, and you can use it for stealth, scouting, social encounters, and combat. The list really goes on and on. So in this episode, we'll be covering the description of the spell from the Player's Handbook. We'll review some gameplay uses and examples you can bring to your table for how to use the spell. We'll get some ideas and opinions from the internet. And last, we'll end with some fun fact information about the spell. Okay, first topic, the spell details. This is a level 2 illusion spell for the Bard, Sorcerer, Warlock, and Wizard classes. The casting time is 1 action. The range is touch. The components are verbal, somatic, and material. The material component is an eyelash in gum Arabic. And the duration is concentration up to 1 hour. A creature you touch has the invisible condition until the spell ends. The spell ends early immediately after the target makes an attack roll, deals damage, or casts a spell. Using a higher level spell slot, you can target 1 additional creature for each spell slot level above 2. Now, some clarifications on the spell. At its core, it seems simple. You make a creature invisible. And while you're invisible, that means a few things. You can't be seen. You have advantage on attack rolls. Attack rolls against you have disadvantage. You have advantage on initiative, and effects that require sight can't target you, unless the creature can somehow see you, through things like blind sight, tremor sense, or other magical spells and abilities. Now, with invisibility being a level 2 spell, this invisibility does end if you make the attack, you deal damage, or you cast a spell. So this is not a combat, stay invisible forever type spell. It's about setup and it's about positioning. Now, the range being touch is also very important, because that means you can cast this on yourself, you can cast it on allies, and it really opens up team-based strategies here. So yes, technically you can cast it on any creature, you just might want to think before turning your enemies or NPCs invisible, because there might be consequences. Now, scaling, this is quite powerful too, because the higher the spell level slot you use, the more creatures you can target. So you can make an entire group invisible. So let's get into some gameplay uses, because this is where invisibility becomes a very powerful spell in this game. So one of the core uses for invisibility is for stealth and infiltration. So as a couple examples here, let's say the party needs to break into a guarded building. Instead of sneaking past the guards normally, you turn the rogue invisible and let them walk straight through. Now you don't need to rely entirely on stealth rolls, you're bypassing a lot of that detection. So the rogue can walk past, 2 guards mid-conversation, open a locked door from the inside, and now you can let the rest of the party inside through a side entrance. Now, in a city setting, you can walk directly through a crowded checkpoint or a gate without needing things like the disguises or the deceptions, so really very powerful here. Same for things like scouting and reconnaissance missions. You can send an invisible party member ahead into a dungeon. They can do things like map out rooms or count enemies. They can identify traps. And now the party can enter with a whole knowledge base instead of just guessing on what's inside. The scout might overhear some enemy dialogue. They could learn about plans before the fight even begins too. So being on the inside allows you to do things like identify enemy leaders, you can identify casters, weak targets, and then you can come back out and strategize. That lets the party prioritize immediately before starting combat here. And then they can even do things like test out routes or find safe pathways through the dungeon or find any dead ends or hidden passages without risking the entire group by being invisible. And the fact that this duration is concentration up to 1 hour, you have lots of time to gather information. Now, there's a lot of fun ways you can use this for social and information gathering as well. So, a couple examples here. During a tense negotiation, you could turn someone invisible and have them listen in. You could have them watch for reactions. You could gather information while the negotiation is taking place. So you now have information the other side doesn't even know you have. The invisible character might notice subtle clues, like guards reaching for weapons, someone signaling behind the scenes or behind their backs. They can read documents, they can look at maps and letters left out in the room without people noticing, and you can eavesdrop on private conversations that your party was never meant to hear in on. So there's a lot of things you can do before combat even comes into play here, but again, positioning for combat is another really strong use of invisibility. So a few examples here. Before combat even starts, you could make not just party rogues, you could make frontliners invisible. So your frontliners can move into position and get behind enemies, and they can start the combat from the perfect spot. So advantage on initiative plus advantage on that first attack is a huge benefit. You could cast invisibility on the barbarian, have them move in between enemy casters and cut off the escape routes before anyone knows they're even there. The rogue getting to turn invisible also lines up really perfectly for that opening strike on a high value target to make sure they're landing those sneak attacks. So using it properly, the party can effectively start combat already in control of the battlefield. Now, let's say that things don't go so well in combat too. Invisibility can help with things like escape and survival. So let's say the fight goes badly. Instead of running normally, you can turn invisible and disengage and get away that way. Enemies can't easily track you, and you can escape before taking more hits. You could duck behind cover, you could go invisible, and then move away while the enemies are assuming you're in one place, but you've already left. And it's very helpful for doing things like break lines of sight and repositioning the group entirely. You can force enemies to guess where you even went. So this can be very beneficial by turning either yourself invisible or your allies, even in a chase scenario, right? You can disappear into a crowd or an ally and completely lose your pursuers. But sometimes invisibility is underutilized because it's not just about turning yourself invisible, you can cast it on those allies, and sometimes that's more beneficial too. So think about casting it on things like the rogue so you can have better infiltration, or the fighter who can get better positioning in combat, or the healer to avoid the healer being targeted. So you can actually enable your team, not just yourself, by sharing that invisibility. A couple other ideas here. You can make a party member who's carrying some sort of important quest item, you can make them invisible so they can move safely through the battle map. You can also do things like protect your spellcasters so they can reposition without being focused down. Or you can set up coordinated plays, one person being the visible distraction, the other person being the invisible operator of the situation. Now, invisibility is also really good in the heist and theft situations too. So, as an example, let's say you need to steal an item. Well, just walk in invisible, grab it, and walk out. You don't need to have a confrontation. You can lift a key from a guard's belt without being seen. You can swap a real item with a fake one without people noticing. Maybe there's a locked display case while the guards are watching the room, but if you're invisible, well, they're not looking for you specifically. It can also help you move through restricted areas without triggering suspicion for you or your group. And the last few ideas I'll mention, a lot about combat setup and the battlefield positioning too. So you can turn invisible, you can move into position on the battlefield, and then do things like attack with advantage or trigger combat on your terms versus the enemy terms. And even though the invisibility ends, the setup is what matters here. So your position behind cover or taking the high ground before you reveal yourself, you can really just move into the middle of enemies and start combat with a perfectly placed spell or attack or fireball and force the enemies to react to you instead of the other way around. Now, keep in mind there's also occasions when you should not be necessarily using invisibility. So, as an example, mid-combat, when the enemies already know your location, not necessarily the best use of your spell, because you go invisible, but they still know roughly where you are, and they can still attack you with disadvantage. So it can be useful, but not always optimal for the situation. If you're standing out in the open, enemies can still swing at your last known position. And even though you're invisible, you're still making noise or interacting with the environment, so you can still give away your location. A lot of enemies also have things like blind sight and tremor sense, or magical detection spells like see invisibility or true seeing. So invisibility might not actually help at all. Now let's shift and talk about some benefits and limitations of the invisibility spell. So benefits, it is an extremely versatile spell. It works in lots of different scenarios. The stealth, the combat setup, the social encounters, the heists. It can also be used on allies, and it has a very long duration. That 1 hour mark is incredibly useful. The scaling to multiple targets can also be a huge benefit, not just in the combat, but also the social situations. It's one of the best planning and control spells. Looking at limitations, though, it does require concentration. And since it ends when you attack or cast spells or deal damage, you have to be cautious about what you're doing so you don't accidentally break that invisibility. It doesn't make you silent either, and it doesn't hide your position automatically, so some creatures can still detect you, and that can get you in even more trouble if you're found being invisible. Now, let's jump over to the internet discussions and opinions. So it should be obvious. The very common take is that this is a very useful spell for things like scouting and infiltration and setup, but a lot of people seem to misuse the spell in combat, because when you use it mid-fight without a plan, it's not necessarily about staying invisible, it's what you're going to do with the spell and the invisibility while you have it. If you're simply using invisibility to get yourself advantage on that one attack, that is not a great use of a level 2 spell. And now it does seem like the group invisibility function is either underrated or underutilized, because the scaling with this spell is very powerful. Bumping it up from level 2 to maybe a level 3 or 4 means you can take 2 to 3 invisible characters to start a fight. It makes it, again, that much more powerful. Instead of just one character popping up in the right location during combat, you can have 2-3 people pop up, and that can make a drastic swing for the combat. Now, a positive take here is that it does enable a lot of creative play too, because players love invisibility. It opens up options on the board, it does encourage a lot of planning, and it rewards the creativity of doing your homework and playing smart. Now let's end on some fun fact information here. The material component for invisibility is an eyelash in gum arabic. So the symbolism of the eyelashes are typically associated with things like sight and vision and perception. So using an eyelash in the spell, you might say that symbolically it represents removing sight or interfering with vision. Now the gum arabic, that is a natural resin from tree sap. Historically, it's been used in a lot of things like ink and binding materials and adhesives, but it's also found in things like soft drink syrups and gummy candies and marshmallows and chocolate candies and other things like shoe polish and the lickable adhesives like stamps and envelopes and paints and ceramics and photography and printing and fireworks. So maybe the combination of the eyelash and the gum arabic means being obscured from sight has so many applications if you're creative enough to think about it. So, invisibility, great spell. It's not just for stealing things, you gotta get creative. Well, that's it for this session of Roll for Insight. Thanks for listening, and thank you to all our supporters on patreon.com/rollforinsightpodcast. And we will see you next time.